Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Chris Torrence tuning in for another episode of the semi-related podcast hosted by Optum. And as many of you know that have frequent tuned in, this is semi-related is certainly not. It's a play on words, and our point is to be entirely unscripted and get to know our guests on a personal level, and then kind of evolve that into how things pertain to the industry we play in, which is more the supply chain, logistics, and transportation space. So, our guest today is someone I haven't met, I don't think personally, but I've certainly, ever since I got the initial outreach of Mike, I was certainly intrigued by his background, some of his numerous just accomplishments in various spaces, from the biggest names in retail. Was a pioneer in the e-com space some years ago, and has since been kind of going back to his roots and doing some advisory work for back in the startup worlds. Without further ado, I want to welcome today's guest, Mike Robinson, joining us. How you doing, Mike?
Chris, I'm doing great. Appreciate you having me on today.
Yeah, I appreciate you being up, man. I'll be honest, the Thanksgiving lag is starting to, when Jacob told me we were going to be doing this Monday morning, I said, I hope I'm out of the food coma by then. But sure enough, a couple cups of coffee later, I seem to be slowly getting there, right?
Yeah, well, I'm right there with you. It's 7:30 in the morning here in San Francisco.
Yeah.
I'm still dealing with the lingering effects of tryptophan. So, we'll just keep going. A couple cups of Java, and everything should be great.
Yeah, man. Well, speaking of Thanksgiving, Mike, do you have any, again, just kind of, it's obviously relevant, and wishing everybody a happy belated Thanksgiving, and hope everybody got through the travel chaos that I think we set some records according to TSA. But Mike, were you out in the Bay Area for the holiday? Did you get some travel in?
I actually traveled to see my family on the East Coast in New Jersey. So I
Wow.
spent a week with them, and I think they would agree it was 5 days too many. And, I would agree it's 5 days too many, but it was a fantastic time.
I'm based in Chicago. I have some family in the D.C., Virginia area, and I would agree. I think at this point in life, love them dearly, no questions asked there. But the 3 day rule seems to be, with a couple travel days mixed in. Man, that seems to checked all the boxes before everybody got a little annoyed. And family is family, right? We love each other, but there's definitely a time to kind of call it, get back to our normal day to day. So
Let me just tell you that there were a lot
yeah,
of long individual walks through the cul-de-sac just to get a little bit of break.
decompress.
Yeah.
Yeah, and work off. I mean, again, it's that time of year where I try, Mike, every year to say I'm going to try to lose at least 10 pounds, just as a because I know it'll be a net wash after this month ends, right? So the walks do help and digest or work up the appetite, but I guess it depends on where you are. Today's a balmy in the teens, I think, here in Chicago, so those walks don't become quite as attractive. But yeah. Well, Mike, yeah, go ahead. Do you have something else to add before we get out to
No,
Thanksgiving?
no. I could go down that rat hole, and I would suggest we kind of lift out of it.
Yeah, it's still fresh, top of
Yeah,
mind. Well,
yeah.
like I said, Mike, we haven't ever met. I'm thankful that some folks in your circle had reached out, and again, just looking at the modern day resume known as LinkedIn can always tell a pretty good story without a ton of context. But I know you've been around for a minute, man. It looks like you got quite a few different roles. But I got to ask you, man, it looks like you starting out in a consulting kind of gig, and obviously, looks like you have some IBM, go over into the apparel space. How did is this something when you're think back to your earlier days there at Penn State or Pepperdine? Is this an area you had always kind of said, I'm interested in supply chain or that ecosystem, or just kind of haphazardly just kind of happened?
Yeah, I would say during my 5th year at Penn State, and there's five is important. I didn't think, 40 years later, I would have gone through kind of an interesting arc and had a nice history in retail, and then come back, as you said, to my roots, and not only doing advisory for startup, but also involved in a startup myself. But no, it didn't start that way. I mean, I was hoping to graduate from Penn State and go to Wall Street, right? That was my goal. I was a finance and accounting major, and thought I'd go make my mark on Wall Street. Unfortunately, Black Tuesday happened in '87, which I'm dating myself now at this point. And so by the time I was getting to graduation, none of the brokerage firms wanted anybody that wanted to finance that had a finance background, that they wanted English lit majors, right? Because they thought they had ethics, right? And
Go figure, right?
right. So that led me into the consumer products industry. I mean, I graduated, I worked for Johnson & Johnson for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Had a chance to not only work in the Philadelphia area, but they gave me an opportunity to move out to Southern California in the Pasadena area and help with an acquisition that I had been involved with in terms of understanding the operation, being able to figure out what was the best thing to do, because our goal was to buy it and move the business. But I found myself, and if you remember the book, The Goal, right? It was about you announce a closure of a manufacturing facility, and all of a sudden it becomes the most efficient operation in the world because people are trying to save their jobs. I lived that experience,
Yeah.
but the writing was on the wall, and it was always going to move east. But my goal was never to come back east. My goal was to stay out west. And that's
Yeah.
when I jumped into management consulting at that point with Pricewaterhouse, and then worked through a series of high-tech, biotech industry experiences, did a lot of international travel. I visited every continent but Antarctica on somebody else's nickel, which I think is always fun to do, right?
It
Um,
sounds like my life. Yeah,
yeah,
Antarctica's
right,
still on the
right.
bucket list. Maybe we'll see what
but
happens.
but I could also share a story with you where I was going through a physical, and the doctor said, you may have a minor case of the bends because of the amount of international travel you're having. And it just hurt. So I knew that I needed to make a change, and there was an opportunity, and this is where the retail experience enters in, because I'd never thought about retail before. And then a friend of mine I'm part of this early stage consulting company that is working with companies to build their first generation e-commerce sites. And it's in San Francisco, so you can live at home, and there may be some travel. And I'm like, sign me up, right? I know nothing about retail other than I'm a consumer.
Right?
And then it became a, a reality of that this became my first real, true professional love, right? I found it. So 25 years ago, about this time, I joined this smaller boutique company that was a rocket ship at that point, in the stead of like the Sapient Science Viance of the time in the late 90s. This was 4 Point Partners here in the Bay Area, and we had plans of going public, and then all of a sudden, the bubble crash happened,
Yeah.
right? And
Yep.
so, but I knew I'd fallen in love with retail, and even though I went back into consulting, and I went back into biotech, and I went back into high tech, I always kept my eye out there for retail opportunity. And at one point, this was before the IBM acquisition of PwC. At this point, that there was an opportunity of, hey, Gap wants to do something different, right? They've got 5 different platforms for each of their brands, and they want to bring them together and unify the platforms, unify the processes. And they need somebody who has a process background. Even though I still didn't quite know retail at this point, it was come aboard and help. And that began my really true journey, because not only did I help in the replatforming, but I ended up joining Gap as an employee for a number of years. And all of a sudden it was like, now I'm working with big retailers, right? And starting to understand what it means to operate stores and operate an e-commerce channel. And how do you think about, at that point, which was multi-channel, which then became omni-channel over time. But it was about, how do you start thinking about customer experience? And that was where that's where it all clicked for me, when it became retail and customer experience. That's when I said, this is where I'm going to make the rest of my career. I'm not sure how, but I'm going to do that.
I'm hooked. Yeah.
And yeah, and I was, and it was like professional heroin at that point, right? I just couldn't get enough, because the beauty of retail is you're only as good as sales yesterday, right? It's
Yeah.
not about you're waiting for the end of the quarter or the end of the month, right? You're talking about yesterday, and in some cases, where I was in e-commerce, it was hour to hour, right? And so I got really hooked on it, and I got tapped on the shoulder, and somebody said, Gap's doing some interesting stuff, but Macy's wants to do something more, right? And they want to throw a lot of investment at it, and they need somebody like you to help come aboard and take it and build the team and build the capability. So I joined Macy's in 2010, and their e-commerce channel was about 700 million at that point. When I left in 2018, it was 7 billion. And I know I had something to do with it. I also know that it was this incredible combination of talent that we surrounded ourselves with.
Yeah.
But I started out in the technology chair, and this is the only place I think you could do this. Started out in the technology chair on the e-commerce side, and ultimately owned the channel, right? And ran the channel, right? Nobody graduates from the technology chair into the business chair, right?
Right.
So that was great, an incredible experience. And again, omni-channel, and now you're talking proliferation of devices, and this is the rise of the pretty much the mobile phone at this point as being the primary shopping device, if in many cases. And the phone alone, when I left, of the 7 billion, was $1 billion on its own, right? In terms of, right, which these you think about it now, and it's just how we live. At that point, it was how we were starting to adopt. 2018, I left, and it was time to go move on to something else, and decided to think about phase 2 of my career, which was I'd fallen in love with working with startups because we interjected them into the Macy's world, being out here in San Francisco. We're the tip of the
Right there in the thick of it. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
right, and we had tons of them come through, and it was like all of them are smarter than I am. Absolutely, every single one of them is smarter than I am. But they can't see the problem that they're about to run into, and I might be able to bring a little bit of maybe some wisdom associated with it. So I've done a series of startup advisories, and then I got tapped on the shoulder to be part of a public company board, Vista Outdoor, which recently just went through a transaction and sold the company. But it was about building a direct to consumer business out of a consumer products business as well. And then and then a buddy of mine and I were talking and said, there's a part of the e-commerce experience that we think there's a better way of doing, right? And it's fulfillment. And he's a fulfillment guy. He is absolutely a warehouse operations, transportation, logistics guy. And I'm like, I just gave you guys a lot of work. Now you're telling me that there might be a better way. And we sat down and started talking about, and that led to the beginning of the eighth notch, which is where
Yeah.
I'm spending most of my time. So I'll pause there. It was kind of a long intro.
No, it's interesting. And again, ironically, it's Cyber Monday. And I think back, Mike, I'm not a spring chicken myself. I mean, brick and mortar, malls, that was all I really knew for a good chunk of my life. And I think it's interesting to have someone of, with your background and just kind of getting in right when e-com. And I think the metric there, I think you said it was Macy's from starting out even in year one or, in the earlier stages at what'd you say, 700 million e-com. And now we're at 7 billion.
Well, it was 7 billion I left. I mean,
When
it's
you left. And who
gone
knows now? Yeah.
10, 11 billion at this point,
Correct.
right?
Yeah. That is impressive. And I think, when I think about that, I don't know that we're going back. And we can, you hear the Amazon effect. And, of course, it's this time of year where a lot of packages out there. Look at my Ring camera, and I'm thinking of how many times did my wife hit the button for some
Right,
reason. So
right.
I don't know that we're going back. And, from my perspective, again, we're more in the optimization of the routing and things like that. And we're seeing a huge tick from surface and all modes of transportation kind of really remodeling their entire network to kind of emulate a lot of this the traditional distribution center into more of like that e-com fulfillment mentality. So, Mike, did that surprise you when you were? Did you have a moment, and maybe it was the team that just started to? What was that? What was the catalyst when you're sitting there working kind of as that e-com boom starts to take shape? Are you sitting there like somebody back in the day at Sears that somebody, and I'm here in Chicago, right? Somebody said, hey, this whole idea of an online catalog for, it's just not who we are. I don't see any future in that, right? And some Bezos guy must have saw it differently. Here we are. But you were there during a lot of that transition. What did you, were there indicators? I'm just curious I want the audience to get a feel of, especially those that are of my age or older, of like, when did it's what all we know now, but there was a period there where there was a massive transition. When did you start to feel that the tides were shifting in that direction?
Yeah, I think I felt it as a consumer first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. In terms of, because it became, the way that I was living my life. I mean, traveling as a consultant, it's super hard, right? You shop wherever you are, right? And I think when it became, I'm no longer sending my credit card information with clear text in an email, right? Where I'm actually typing it into a website where it feels real at this point. And I think it became around, watching people's lives spin faster and faster and faster, and the convenience effect. And then you knew the Amazon effect was what was definitely happening, but they were still relatively early in the number of categories that they were at that point. I think it's when, I think for me, I think the Gap experience solidified it. But the Macy's experience, when I got there and said, we're going to invest. And here is this, what was seen as a stodgy department store saying, we want to leapfrog everybody. We want to go after, everyone. And basically, the leadership there said, Amazon is our number one competitor. They realized at that point, they said, from a store's perspective, we got to think about the JCPenney's and the Nordstroms and stuff. But from a digital perspective, we have to think like Amazon. And that's when I knew that it was like, it's on, right? Because as soon as you've got one of the largest retailers in America saying, I'm going to invest differently, and they did. And I am the benefactor of, maybe to the detriment of the stores channel, because the stores got starved because we ended up getting fed. That's when I knew it was going to be. And when I started seeing things like growing by 50% a year, right, that you knew that, the game is on, right? And we're making every other part of the organization creak at that point, right? Especially on the fulfillment side, where they're like, because we're building mega centers now. We're starting to think not only regionally, but across the country, trying to figure. Now we're thinking about inventory placement. Then we're thinking about activating stores as how we could ship from stores. When it became that network effect, that's when
Yeah.
you knew you'd never go back. And then
Yeah.
I would say that like the kicker of this was the lockdown period during COVID, when everybody said,
Oh yeah.
I have no choice. Everything has to come to me. And there was a permanent, step function up of about, probably, 100 to 200 basis points of just,
Inc-
it's never going back. And it was such an injection of just adoption across the board. Now everything is brought to me, not just the underwear and the groceries, but it's everything. It's
It's
everything,
everything.
and this is the rise of the Grubhubs, and this is the rise of delivery. And so all of a sudden, you got more people out delivering than you have people going out to buy things. And the stores still have an incredibly important role in this. And I think that will, and we saw a shift back after lockdown where people said, I got to get out. And so
Right.
there was this kind of, dulling effect in terms of the e-commerce side. And then it just exploded again. And we're right back to it. And you mentioned Cyber Monday, right? Normally, I have the shakes on a day like today because I'm just making sure I don't break anything. I don't want to get yelled at the day because it's the biggest day of the year, and
Yeah.
it's nice to be on the consumption side instead of on the sales.
Right. Yeah, I saw the evening news was at a Walmart fulfillment center last night, just talking about the sheer amount of volume that's expected just to be pumped out over the next give or a few weeks, if you will. But and I think Cyber Monday was a day. Right now, I feel like everybody's just saying, why do you have to make it one day? Right at this time of year, everyone's looking to get through that final hurdle and across the finish line with happy numbers to report. So yeah, I'm with you, Mike. I guess and CPG, my wife and I were talking about this. There's absolutely some things that we feel like I don't want to go away. It's the time, right? It's my time's more valuable than go get items that are pretty, just pretty generic and replenishment, if you will, even at consumer level. When you switched over to apparel, I think that's where things get interesting, though, right? Because we were, again, this is like Thanksgiving conversation, right? Watching Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. So you're sitting there, that may be what spawned the conversation of, when's the last time you went to the mall or you went to a Macy's or a Gap? And I think there was like some mentality, maybe it's nostalgia of like just getting out there in the holidays and taking all that in, right? But with apparel in particular, there are absolutely things that I personally feel if I've worn it in the past, same brand, know the fit, know the size, maybe that's different. But a lot of times I feel like apparel could be the last standing brick and mortar because there's so much variation of clothing and just things of that nature that you really want to try on and feel. Is that something that when you were and maybe this wasn't really a prevalent conversation during your time at Gap and Macy's, and you had been at J&J, right? A little different, right? But what are your thoughts there? Do you think the consumer still craves to go out and have some experience of the hunt and shopping, or are we just getting to the point really we just want to stay on the couch?
I think it's a little of both, right?
Yeah.
I think the fit and flattery conversation is one that,
Yeah.
and that's where I've actually spent some time on the advisory side, trying to
Yeah.
figure out, because I do think, in terms of the product discovery and product selection side, it's the piece that hasn't been broken. You try with size guides, and companies like TrueFit have tried to say, if you
Yeah.
work in this brand at this size, that this brand will work. They've never really figured out how to turn that inside out. But it's funny. I was talking to my beloved aunt. She's 78 years old, right? And she goes, it bothers me that there aren't stores for me to go to anymore to be able to try something on. So what I do is I just buy 5 colors and 5 sizes, and then I got to go through the hassle of returning,
The
even though
reverse logistics. Yeah.
right,
Reverse.
even though it's free to her. It's a mess on the retailer side, and we all know the waste impact of this, right? In
Yeah.
terms of this is causing significant cost issues, but also just significant impacts from a sustainability standpoint. In terms of much of that stuff ends up in a landfill, and it's tough, right? So I think that's where the retailer is still struggling to figure out how to do that. Again, if it's things like I've got a hoodie on, right? I know the brand. I know that the size that I order will always work. So if I buy another one like it, the only thing I'll worry about is if, that the color doesn't, it didn't show up true on the screen.
Right. Right.
Right. So I have confidence in it. But, women with dresses, men with suits, right? Pants, right? And again, that those are less and less as the casualization of America
That's
continues.
another great point.
Right.
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 But also shoes, right? Right. I mean, how many of us buy, half size down, a normal size and a half size up just to make sure? I know I do. I'm a
Yeah.
golfer. I'm a golfer. I
Right.
want comfortable shoes.
Yeah.
And so I'll buy 3 pairs of shoes and return 2. And I know it's terrible, right? But it's just easy. And when it's free. Now, retailers are cracking down. They're starting to say, I'm going to charge you to send stuff back, or there's a limited amount of time, or because they're starting to recognize that the cost of the reverse logistics piece is
Yeah.
massive.
Yeah, I was saying, and just the waste, and we'll kind of transition because I know you're a big believer in the
Yeah.
sustainability mindset, as am I. But again, I call it just a lot of time around the TV during the holidays this past week, and I saw a piece that was talking about. I think we underestimate just. I think there was a Netflix doc on just buy it now. I don't know if you saw it, but it was kind of taking that approach of just this the lifestyles that we lead of just literally everything on a smartphone, but like things that are intentionally have a shelf life. And then just the sheer amount of disposal and just how much that really is having a global impact. And I think that gets lost in the mix, right? If I buy a device, whether it's an electronic piece or any widget, any item that eventually it has to go somewhere. And I think we underestimate just how much at scale and aggregate that is a ton of waste on the planet. And I don't know that we've really gotten ahead of that. I know when economic times are great, we have a lot more focus on sustainability measures. But at least in my industry, I feel like when times, when they tighten up, those initiatives kind of start to go towards the back of the back burner a bit. And it's bothersome because I think, again, it's call it this documentary still fresh in my head, but I never really understood the magnitude of just how much waste that we're putting onto the earth, man. It's crazy. And I have young kids, so I'm like, not for me, it's for them and the generations after them. Thanks to us, right? We've created this, this stockpile of just waste, and I don't have the answer, but I'd
I
love to
don't.
hear from you. Yeah,
Well, I definitely don't have the answer, to be honest with you. I mean, I think it needs small change. Small changes can potentially create big outcomes, right? And I'm not in the material space, right. I'm in the final mile space, trying to figure
yeah,
out how best to get the packages to you in a more efficient manner, so it minimizes the number of times that a delivery truck stops. I think the larger existential question that you ask, and the one we were teasing around as we think about how do people consume differently so they return differently or don't return differently, or after a shelf life, right? Like, all of our electronics, right? And the fact that they end up, getting shipped back to China or shipped back to India for scrap parts, right? To try and get the heavy rare earth metals out of them. I mean, there's so many components. I get lost sometimes, right? Which is why anytime I get lost, Chris, I try to simplify it, right?
try
And
to, yeah,
and that's what ended up becoming the birth of the eighth notch. There's this massive inefficiency out there with this massive potential impact from a sustainability standpoint. How do we minimize it to a section that we can A, understand, B, do something about, and C, actually explain to people, right? So yes, I am a huge proponent of thinking sustainably differently, and whether it's the climate change discussion or just the impact on the earth in terms of just our water supply and our air supply and things of that nature, it doesn't matter to me, right? I'm not going to get lost in the politics of it. What
and
we're
that's
doing now,
unfortunate. Everything's politicized. We know that.
that's right. But what we're doing now ain't working, right? And it's creating more damage than good, right? And our consumption patterns have to change in some way, shape, or form. But I also war against myself, Chris, because I'm a capitalist, right? I'm a
Yeah,
retailer, right. I want people
fine.
to
That's
consume,
balancing act.
right,
Yeah,
right. I want people to, but I just want them to consume smarter,
I think that's the way. That's the message. Yeah.
and that's where I think and I've written a couple of articles on this, on conscious consumerism. I think
Yes.
if it's not our generation, it's our kids, right, who will think differently about this, who are thinking differently about this, and will react differently and will choose differently. Like, I do wear this hoodie for a reason. It's because I feel better because it's made from bamboo fiber, so it's
Yeah.
it's kind of renewable, right? Is
Right.
it my favorite? Maybe not, right? But every time I wear it, I feel, man, maybe a little bit better, right? Because when it's at the end of its life, it's also recyclable as well.
Right.
So I've kind of gone full circle in terms of this one garment. That's not the rest of my closet probably isn't that
Probably
way,
not.
but it's starting somewhere. And that's where I think we all need to make just small choices that start to have this outsized impact.
Well, and you see staggering numbers about what we recycle at my home, and I think that's at least an initiative here in the state of Illinois. I know out west it definitely is. Might be a mandate, but then you see the actual numbers of what actually. I think it's like less than 10%. actually of these materials actually get recycled, which is heartbreaking because you're thinking if I'm doing my part, where's the breakdown, right? Is it just, and that's another question I think that still looms when you hear those numbers being thrown out. Where does it go after my recycling bin if it's 6 to 10% of all those items are actually there? That's a small number. That's heartbreaking.
It is, but it's also a number that continues to creep up, right? So, right,
Thankfully,
and I
yeah,
think as you know, I think the adoption curve on that one is really economic driven, right?
yeah,
Right,
as always.
once I recycle it, what do I do with it, right? Right, and there are companies out there that find a way to take those recycled plastics and turn them into garments, or turn them into water bottles, or turn them into something else. I think that's where the ingenuity of the human mind comes into place
You bet.
in terms of how do you continue to think about recycling. I mean, if we can do that by sending people into space with a minimum amount of things, and they have to recycle everything that's there. There has to be a way that we think about that ecosystem on the planet side. But again, I still think it's going to come through these small breakthroughs that people have that cause people to think differently, but also the consumer starting to adopt differently and demanding it. And I think we're seeing that. Maybe not as widespread as I would like, right? And definitely red state blue state type of thing, right,
Boy,
because it is
yeah.
politicized. But I think at some point you get past that by saying it's just the better way.
And I think the younger generations, Mike, I feel like they've embraced a mindset of more of taking care of the planet because shame on us, we haven't. You and I came up in the 80s of the era of excess and having everything, and I think now with ecom that is the downside, right? We've made it so convenient. It goes back to the old my mother and father many years ago. The wants versus needs, right? Do
Yeah.
you want it? Do you need it? And now technology's enabled us to not even have to. We don't even have to. It's too easy to just hit the button. Yeah, I'm with you. I think there's a balancing act there. Mike, you mentioned what you're working on now. I think I wanted to kind of get into that and segue a little bit because I think there's a misnomer of just, every Thanksgiving, and this is, I always tell people, Chris, what is logistics and what do you do? And I think every year I had to try to explain it. I'm like you, I try to simplify it. I always tell people COVID, thanks to the toilet paper shortage, I think that really kind of drove the message home when people realize it's not always there on the shelf. It's not always at Costco, whatever your retailer is. And people started asking, well, that's true. How does it, where does it get produced and manufactured? How does it get to the retail outlet? And I think that was the first year in all my years of explaining what my career entails that people kind of got it at the table. But I want to talk about, I think there's another component of supply chain in general and fulfillment, ecom, we're trying to appease this consumer that has this it's always a narrowing of the expectations get greater and greater and that our tolerance for waiting is getting less. And I think that people probably, we take it, it's like supply chain in a lot of ways it's like the air we breathe. We take it for granted till things aren't there, right? And some of these COVID anomalies that happened, right, that further accentuated just how important. I know I've never seen in my 25, 30 years in this industry a peak of just sheer amount of capital infusion. Just as you said, a pandemic has us sitting at home going, what do I do with all that vacation money? Might as well buy some outdoor furniture, whatever, right? And I mean, that really put a spotlight on our industry, supply chain as a whole. But I think, again, when you kind of move into the eighth notch and what you're working on, you make a good point. There are things that consumer behavior can do to help kind of drive from a sustainability approach. But when you think about operationally, how all this happens behind the scenes, it is, again, it's massive. It's a massive undertaking. If you haven't been, I know not everybody can get a chance to go inside been a couple Amazon fulfillment centers, and it's incredible in a word. And I think that maybe with the eighth notch, can you tell us kind of how you guys through this initiative are looking at kind of simplifying? You alluded to some things earlier, and I think a lot of what I do at Optum, I think there's some parallels there on efficiency, rather from routing and consolidating and aggregating. And I think that's seems to be a big initiative for the eighth notch. Tell us more about the genesis of this. You kind of touched on it earlier, and get into a little deeper for the audience to know, what cool name, by the way, but what exactly, what does that mean, right? We tend to use a lot of buzzwords at this day and age, right? And I think a lot of folks are but break it down into layman's terms. What does it really translate into?
Yeah, and I'll start with the origin story, right? Because it started with the founder, Jamie Sapp, longtime friend of mine and deep in the logistics side. He worked at UPS. He's been on the retail side from a logistics standpoint. And so, he and I were out in his suburban neighborhood. It's a suburb of San Francisco. and we're out for a walk in the cul-de-sac, right?
As you do.
And as you do, right, right. You've had a nice dinner. Well, let's take a long walk. He and I had played golf and had dinner, and then decided
Yeah.
to take a walk. And we're watching these delivery trucks come up and down the street. And he goes, "Does that happen in your neighborhood?" I'm in the city, and I said, "Look, yeah, I live on a fairly quiet street, but most of the traffic is delivery trucks, and it's all brands, right? UPS, FedEx, Amazon, On Track, USPS, et cetera. Because and this was 2019, right? So this is still pre-pandemic. And he goes, "Does that make sense to you?" And I said, when I see the same brand go by 2 or 3 times a day, right, and every day, it feels like there's got to be a better way. And he goes, "That's what I want to build a business around." He goes, I want to take this notion of that that the best route to a sustainable mile is the one never driven," right? Was kind of this catchphrase that we
I saw
came
your
up with.
website. That is the tagline. Yeah. Yeah.
And we came up with it early on and said, so what does that really mean to us? And what it meant to us was we don't want to change the way that consumers consume. Let them consume, right? Well, let someone else figure out how to teach them differently there, which speaks well to me as a retailer because I don't want to change that. And I said, but let's figure out how we and you use words like, organize and schedule and aggregate differently, so that truck only needs to stop once or 3 times in front of Mike's house a week instead of 5. And it still drops off everything that has been ordered from a myriad of retailers, right? Right, that all go through that same carrier's network, that all come to Mike's address. And so we started with the problem of working on the delivery address backwards, right? So what would we need to do in order to do that? And what we found is, as we kind of picked it apart and picked it apart and picked it apart, it was we just needed to determine when it got injected into the process, when it started its journey of the of the of the of the of the of the quality of the network and the efficacy of the network, in terms of being able to, once it starts this journey from an origin to its destination, it's highly predictable. It's in 97, 98%. Sometimes weather and time of year can change that and
Yeah.
elongate that, but they have to do that because they have to schedule everything on its journey, right? The planes, trains, and automobiles that need to be
Hmm.
done. And so we said, well, if and we said, so we said, if we could figure out how to change the behavior up front, we can probably figure out how to get packages to connect in the final sort hub into the back of the truck, into the driver's hands, to be dropped off at the same time. And we said, there's got to be money in that. And then we both started talking and said, and there's probably a sustainability angle here as well,
Sure.
right? Because there has to be carbon that's not created. So we approached the 2 largest package carriers in the US at the same time. Both of them said, we absolutely love this idea. We've been trying to figure it out ourselves. One of them called back, right? And so we've been in partnership with that one. I can't tell you who it is,
That's okay. Yeah. 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 I
but
can
you would flip
figure
a
it out.
coin, but you would flip a coin and be right half the time and wrong half the time. And so for the last couple of years, we've been working on building the platform, adding some AI componentry to it from a predictability standpoint, and then starting to roll out through some of their major accounts. And so what we also did at the same time is we said, we have to make this lucrative for everyone, beneficial for everyone. So how do we do that? So we said to the carrier, and we said, every time that truck doesn't stop, they said, you mean a delivery stop? We said, yes, that's the term. Well, every time that delivery stop doesn't happen, it's multiple dollars of operational cost savings that they have. It's the wear and tear on the truck, it's the
Oh yeah.
gasoline, it's the timing of the driver as well. And they said, okay, that's a pool of dollars. And we said, is there a sustainability component? And their IEs looked at it and said, yeah, it's about 800 grams of CO2 that's never created. And I said, well, that's currency. How do we use that currency? And so we set up this 3-way gain share model, right? The carrier keeps a large piece of it. They incent the retailer to implement this program, and every time that they ship on the date that we tell them to, they benefit from it. And then we take a piece of it as well, because we actually own the platform and we
Yeah.
create
Yeah.
the opportunity, right? So we said, if we figured out how to do this, would this make sense? And the carrier's like, it's potentially hundreds of millions of dollars a year, right? Retailer looks at it and says, that's potentially pennies of EPS annually, right? If I do it right. And to us, we look at it and say, we can operate a business this way. And then when they looked at it through the sustainability lens, and they're saying, here's my way to get to my sustainability gains without having to invest differently. I don't have to buy new trucks. I don't have to move over to solar. I don't have to go to natural
All that
gas.
CapEx that usually it's associated. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And what I'm effectively doing ultimately over time, if when we do this completely at scale, is we are compressing routes, we're minimizing days of delivery, and ultimately taking trucks off the road.
Yeah.
That's the plan.
Mike, do you think that, and again, I think there's a tendency in probably every industry, and this one's no exception, supply chain logistics, people tend to bucket you. So when they look at you, they go, oh, so you're a TMS, right? You're an ERP, you're a warehouse management solution, you're a scheduling solution, you're an optimization or routing vendor. When you simplify it, where does the eighth notch, where do you see, does it ride the line of like a scheduling / routing kind of optimizations? Because they're all data points and they are factors and there's constraints. You know this all too well, but where do you classify if you have to get in a bucket? Maybe it straddles a few.
It definitely straddles a few because of where we can integrate along a retailer's journey. It could be at the end in terms of arbitration, right? In terms of I pick one carrier over another because of a cost incentive. It could be in advance of the pick, pack, and ship at the warehouse management level, right? In terms of because I'm telling you when to pick, pack, and ship.
Mm-hmm.
So you hold the order for a period of time. I think part of that is because we don't have the very specific identity, people start to dream, right? So there's good and bad that goes along with that. We like the dreamers because they start saying, could I fit it here? Could I fit it here? Could I fit it here? And so we've got a bunch of different flavors that we're working on. But it all comes down to that same question, right? And ultimately, our goal is to be up in checkout, right? Which is where, I mean, if you're watching every time that you check out at Amazon, they're incenting you or pushing you in the direction that is operationally best for them.
Naturally. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they start talking about, well, you don't need it. Do you need it right now, or could you get it next Tuesday? Right? And they'll put a little green leaf next to it because you've
Yeah.
done something
Little
sustainable.
reminder. Yeah. Yeah.
Everything that we're talking about is exactly what we're offering to retailers as well. That if you want to take it upstream and put it into checkout and say, hey, look, and maybe even reinvent free shipping, right? And saying if you need it, I mean, you obviously have the expedited one, but if you still need it in that 3 to 5 day time frame, I'm going to charge you a couple of bucks to kind of offset the cost, right? But if you still want free, 7 to 9, we're going to do our best to figure out how to get it with you with another package that's already en route. And what we're seeing is that because we don't have the very specific identity, people are dreaming to figure out where best to be able to plug it into how they want to operate. So I think there's pros and cons that go along with that. But because we are flexible enough to be in different spots and there's different interpretations of how to operate with us, it all comes down to the same thing. When does the package start its journey? When do you gain that financial incentive? And when do you take carbon out of the system?
Right. How do you this juxtapositioning of the consumer expectation, right? Which again seems to be we're getting more and more. I mean, it used to be, made to stock, then made to spec. Now it's like I literally need it next. And again, do I need it in 2 hours from now or today? And I think there's a cost, right? And you alluded to that. I think when this whole e-com boom started, no one really considered the fact that there's a large percentage of these things that, for a myriad of reasons, people are like, yeah, it's not what I wanted. I'm going to send it back. And I think we started to realize now after having enough data points to go, there's that reverse logistics piece. There's a huge cost. But I go back to the dynamic of a consumer expectation, a behavior, and then trying to, but how do you match that, marry that to your point? If I'm at checkout and I'm saying, hey, I've got a bunch of items, could I wait a few more days? And I don't know, I don't have it could be a 3-day, 5-7 day window, whatever that may be. I'm just curious. I'd love to see some data around the feedback from the consumer going, are they buying into this? Are they saying, yeah, I'll wait? Or are the same is the buying mentality of a consumer that's really that, I want it. The reason I want it is because I've made an emotional buy and I need it now. And I'm not willing to wait. And I don't care if there's a cost. And I think that's where it gets interesting because, again, you're dealing with the psychology of trying to create a behavior that's incentivizing them and the company itself to go, we can make the whole process more efficient if we're willing to kind of give and take a little. But then again, you got some consumers, I could care less, right? That's the nature of how people sometimes think.
I think it's the notion of that neither absolute is 100%, right?
Yeah.
Right. That those that need it really, really quickly, great. There are some items you'll definitely need quickly, and you're willing to pay an upcharge, or you're saying I won't wait, right? And I need it faster. There are others that will sit there and say, yeah. And I worked in the milk industry for a while, right? And we always talked about the wall of milk, right? right? The cows never stopped producing. The milk came on, but the scheduler had to figure out cottage cheese versus ice cream versus sour cream.
And these are perishables. Yeah, it makes it fun. Yeah.
Many of us have a wall of boxes coming at us, right? Right. And we don't know what's coming. Like I'm coming back from Thanksgiving and I put everything on hold. I know that the post office is going to bring a bunch of things, and UPS is going to bring a bunch of things, and FedEx is going to bring something as well. Things that I bought as part of Black Friday are already starting to show up. I don't know what's coming to me. So if it was Mike Robinson, we're going to do everything we can to bring everything together at the same time, I'd say sure. So I think but I will share a couple of statistics with you, right? Somewhere between 67% and 75% of consumers in one of the studies that we tend to quote said that, I am willing to wait longer if I know you're going to do something better.
Yeah.
By better means you're going to do something that is more sustainable. And so they're starting to do that. And I believe Amazon is going through the great conditioning moment, right? They conditioned us to go free and fast, right? Well, guess what? The free went away as soon as Prime came on, but we still think it's free, right? Right. Even though you pay $150 a year for it, right? And they're starting to tell you how much you've saved, that they've got a counter out there.
The Black Friday, mark it up and then put it on sale, right?
Right.
Like these stupid humans right here, they never.
But Prime as a loyalty program worked because I believe the shipping is free, right? Even though I get other services for Prime, and then they took away the fast component of it because it used to be next day, 2-day. Now it's that there is a whole series of options,
Yeah.
and now they're adding in this third piece of if you're willing to wait, I can do something that's better for the earth. Right. Right. And they add the green leaf to it and they talk about what sustainability means and how they approach it. So I've always looked at it as once Amazon starts conditioning their consumer set, the rest of retailers' consumer set is being conditioned.
Yeah.
Right. And the retailers that don't move fast enough are going to get left behind for the third wave, honestly, like they did in wave 1 and wave 2. And so our argument has been your number one competitor is already doing this. You should be leaning in because we can bring this to you in a much simpler fashion. Now there will still be things like like I ordered something from Amazon and they said they'll have it here to me at 4:00 in the morning. Well,
Overnight delivery, yeah.
overnight, I didn't ask for it, right? But it's clearly they had somebody who was coming off shift who was near me that they could put it in his car and have it, delivered to me as this gentleman was driving home or this young woman was driving home.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, great. I'm curious to see. And I waited until 4 a.m. to see who the driver was. And it literally was somebody coming out of the facility on their way home that they make a little bit of extra money by doing overnight deliveries.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting model that they're doing it, but they're doing it with operational impact in mind, right?
Yeah.
Because they didn't have to load the truck and send it over to my neighborhood. They didn't have to put me on, but they just said somebody was already headed in your direction, kind of like Uber, right? Right.
I was going to say I worked at Uber, and I think that crowdsourcing model was just all the underutilized capacity, if you will, and even just in a given vehicle, like, you got a driver, and it's a lot of empty seats there. Why are we not taking? And now we look back, and how do we miss this? And now Uber Direct is now an initiative back in my early days that was ideation stage and there was a lot of components there, but now they're bringing it back. And that might be a similar, that's the model I think you referred to of the guy that's getting off shift and going, hey, I'm Mike's neighbor. Yeah, I'll drop it off. Yeah, sure. That's fine.
Or I'm driving through his neighborhood on my way.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and you clearly understand it better than I, but it's just, again, it's this notion of people are recognizing there are inefficiencies to be taken out of the system.
Yeah.
Right. With a very simple change. And from a consumer standpoint, I'm starting to look at that and go, I didn't need it at 4 a.m., but it was kind of cool that it got here at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't waited up or met the young gentleman at the door, I wouldn't have known that. But it's kind of this magic that goes on in the background. So I believe that consumers will continue to be conditioned this way. They'll start demanding it from every other retailer that they're working with. They'll start saying, I'm not going to shop with you unless you give me an option like this.
Right. And you mentioned, Mike, I know it's at least at Uber, we use the liquidity and the density term a lot, right? Trying to get it at scale, right? To be able to even to orchestrate that and to achieve it operationally would require a ton of density. And of course, that with Uber anyway, it started to, obviously it's worked. But I think in terms of package delivery and things along, we're still, I think there's opportunity, and you alluded to that quite a bit. I'm 100% with you. I just feel like we're all still kind of thinking about, are we down at the most granular level to really max out efficiency? And what are the liabilities? What are the risks? Always questions at the boardroom, right? Things I've dealt with too of, what is the commodity that I'm hauling in is there a risk there? If something happens to it, who's responsible? Those are the legalities, right? Inevitably always come up. And I think those are the challenges I see a lot in this cool technology.
Well, it's a really interesting question. The thing is, at least for us in our first iteration, we're dealing with one of the major two package carriers with their network, with their drivers, right? And nothing makes a driver happier than when he has to make one stop and drop off multiple packages.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It makes his life that, because there's nothing he hates more than having to go every single stop every single day. And, I mean, that there's a cost issue, that there's just a wear and tear on the human being. I mean, we are in the season that we will be having deliveries until 10, 11 o'clock at night at this point, where drivers will keep coming. If you found a way to be able to compress his route where he was done by 6, he's probably pretty happy. Right.
Pretty happy.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think there's a human toll on the worker as well. And I know that, if you're using the same network and you're not crossing carrier and it's just everything that was originally coming to Mike Robinson over 5. I mean, I use a Macy's example, which is one of my favorite ones. I left Macy's and I said, that there's a couple things I should buy before I leave. And one of them was I bought 5 white t-shirts. So 5 white t-shirts came from 4 different locations over 3 different days. And it's a basic white t-shirt. So you would think that all 5 white t-shirts, even if they came from 4 locations, would show up on the same day. They didn't. They showed up on 3 days, right? Right. So the first day, right, I get it. And I go, well, that's the first t-shirt. Where are the other 4? I'm knowledgeable enough that I don't call customer service, but most of our customers would call and say, where are my other 4 t-shirts?
Right.
And then you get the second, delivery. And you go, well, I'm still missing 2, right? And then you wait for the third one. And then you're like, well, now it's come over 3 days. Did I get 5? Right? There's so much customer, angst that can potentially go into this when you're talking about a split shipment type of scenario at the retailer level. That we're solving not only the cross retailer issue of things coming from multiple retailers to Mike's house and being delivered at the same time. We're also solving the split shipment from the same retailer option as well. Not asking them to change their inventory approach. All we're saying is we will tell you when to ship those 4 boxes to Mike, right? And they'll all show up on the same day. Not looking to repackage, not doing any of that stuff. But from a customer experience standpoint, it would have been a lot easier if those 5 white t-shirts from 4 different locations showed up on one day.
Agreed.
Instead of the 3.
Mike, tell us, I'm a big believer in like the tangible, and I think that the t-shirt example maybe is what I was looking for on the tangibility component. So we're talking about, again, the IP that you guys have introduced. I read it's the first of its kind, right? And can you give us like a life cycle? And we can use the t-shirts if you want. Is that, and maybe you just did, can you go back into kind of behind the scenes and how that would come to fruition from a synchronization orchestration perspective?
Sure. Yeah. And I'll use the 5 white t-shirts, 4 locations.
Yeah. Easy. Yeah.
So multi-location retailer like Macy's probably has inventory everywhere, right? Because they're trying to figure out how to do it from a store perspective, how to do it from a DC perspective, how to service the Northeast differently than the Southwest.
That's right. A lot of moving parts.
Incredibly complicated, right? And almost nigh on impossible to get right. And we're talking about a basic item, and it was this broken, right? It was white t-shirt, same size, right? Same brand, exactly the same. What we would do is we would take a look at that order that Mike Robinson put in and say, all right, you've made your decision on where you're going to ship it from. What's the longest lead time one, right? And if it's going to take 4 days to get to Mike, all right, that package starts its journey right away. But everything else might have a 3-day time in transit or a 2-day time in transit, or one came from a local store here, it has a 1-day time in transit. Right? Instead of everything shipping on the same day as that longest lead time item, we would stagger the beginning of it. Think of it as like an Olympic race around the circle that they stagger when they all start, right? Based on the distance from
passing the baton. The relay model. Yep.
And so, that the one that is going to be there in 4 days ships immediately. The one that's going to be there in 3 days ships 1 day off. The one that takes 2 days, staggered 2 days. Yeah. And the last one, you'd stagger until the end. Some retailers get uncomfortable holding items that long because
they're measured by keeping product on their books.
They are. Right? 15% of the time, we're not talking about all of their orders, 15% of the time that we can find an opportunity for them to be better. right?
Yeah.
15 to 20% we can find.
That's a
And
big number at scale, right?
it also says that, the same consumers in America are consuming from the same retailers in America,
Right,
right?
right,
Right,
right.
right, and asking for all these things to be brought them on this continuous basis. And we ask probably on average a little over a day hold, right, in terms of when you do that. So it's rare that you get into that 2 3 4 day, right? Mine was kind of extreme around that, but we're asking for this really small operational change. Again, to your point, internal measurements is one of the things that we have to fight against, right, in terms of someone saying pick optimization sometimes is something that we have to fight against, because that they look at, if we weren't there, we would have taken this into an optimized pick discussion, going into that part of the warehouse. Well, actually it just falls into one the following day or the following day in terms of being able to do that. It all normalizes out after about the first week of implementation, where all we've done is we've just shifted orders in and out in terms of how things are being picked in the warehouse and being and starting their journey. But it really comes down to, taking a look at time, right? Taking a look at available time. And I think one of the things I didn't mention earlier is that as a retailer, I wanted to make sure that we didn't get in the way between the retailer and the customer. So
Right.
we never violate the customer promise, right? If we said it'll be there between 5 and 7 days, the retailers most likely are focused on the front end of that, trying to get it there as fast as possible. Saying you've already created this implicit contract. Take advantage of maybe the back end a little bit of that in terms of being able to get it there. It's there for you. Customers don't call until you get past that date.
Right.
So take advantage of that because there's value to be unlocked. And I think that's, it's when people get over that notion of that speed is the only thing that's important, then
Velocity. Yeah.
they start to go, what can I do with this? Right?
Yeah.
How does this go into my loyalty program? How do I start measuring this from a sustainability standpoint? How do I start talking about this? I mentioned earlier, how do I think about free shipping differently, right? It's another tier that I might create. You need in that 3 to 5, pay a couple dollars, right, in order to offset my costs. But if you really want free, then we'll put it down here in this 5 to 7 time frame,
Yeah.
and we'll give you every chance that we can. Maybe it's a choice in terms of what happens if you want to do a return, but
Right.
you can only do returns if you choose the most sustainable option. I mean, there's so many things that I think that retailers are going to have to think about as they look at the options that they have available to us. I don't think they've ever looked at fulfillment other than it's really expensive and all I can do is disappoint. It's rare that I can exceed expectations.
Yeah. You look at, and again, I think I saw a stat at what 6 billion parcel packages and deliveries, and that's probably like a previous year, and who knows what the numbers will be at the end of this retail season. Mike, are you guys when you think about like from a modal perspective, is your software up? Is it who is your customer? I know you mentioned again. Is it more parcel focused, or does it touch into LTL or truckload or coming off the boats or in the ports, or is it just more when it gets to that? Where does the journey start from your software? Where does it plug
Yeah,
in?
yeah, I love the question, Chris, because I think that's the kind of dreaming that we want, right?
Yeah,
Right. We are definitely package, right? We are ground, right?
parcel.
We are
Yeah,
parcel, and it's direct to consumer or it's B2B as well, right? It can happen in that space as well, but the metaphor can happen anywhere, right? Right. It's this notion of if I can be more organized and be more synchronized, what value can I unlock? And if I take away speed as the only metric that I care about, how do I think about the problem differently? And then I think the pieces just start to fall together in terms of what else people might think about doing.
I think you nailed it, man. I think that's just it. Speed is always it's again that customer demand. How do we continue to meet that cardinal rule of the customer service? They're always right, that mentality, right? But I'm with you. I think that organizations that are fulfilling these things need to really step back and weigh it out. And maybe like to your point, Mike, speed it's an important variable. Let's not get it twisted. But I like that if we're able to kind of meet in the middle somewhere and incrementally start taking advantage of that additional time, and speed still falls in the from a prioritization list, it's up there, but it doesn't have to always be the end all and be all because we're understanding the immense amount of cost and wasted inefficiency and what we can get into the sustainability and the carbon footprint, all of that, right? It all ties in, but I'm 100% in your corner on, I hope more organizations step back and see that opportunity to make themselves as an organization run more efficiently. There's a cost to that if you're not. So
There is.
I'm hopeful that the people tuning in today, and maybe they happen to be sitting at a supply chain role at a big retail outlet or a parcel carrier, and start to hopefully this message just reverbs throughout their halls and their own offices. So
No, and I appreciate that, Chris. And I think part of the unlock is that how do you filter sustainable, how do you filter sustainability into that conversation in terms of it's a better option.
right, that's right. Mike, when you talk about again, I'm kind of looking at I grew up in that brick and mortar. Do you think in the future, man, do you think that what is brick and mortar still, what's the future look like? I mean, you see a lot of vacant malls and anchor stores that used to be the thriving department stores of the 80s and 90s to some, back early 2000s even. But is the future now, do you think that if I'm a big retail holder, and you could use Macy's or any of the other big box retailers, you see a lot of them just struggling at the brick and mortar level because of this huge wave of e-com and that model. What is the future? Are we still going to go to stores? What need the news? If I'm Walmart, I'm going, that's a real estate play. I got a ton of real estate. Is that notion of, hey, you can come in and get it. It serves as a source for product that we can have shipped to you or delivered rather to your residence. What's the future of brick and mortar right now? And I think you see a lot of the numbers coming out, and there's some not always great, right? And I think it depends on how you dice those metrics up, but is there going to be the future brick and mortar as we know it today or have known it historically?
It's a really great question. I think it's been one that the retail industry has been struggling with for the better part of the last decade or so. Again, I think COVID exacerbated it in some cases.
100%. Yeah.
Terry Lundgren, the former CEO at Macy's, maybe one of the smartest retailers that I've ever known. And he would often say, we are overstored in America, and it could be to the tune of 30,000, right? And I think we continue to see this contraction in terms of the number of physical locations. I think the ones that get it right are the ones that provide a reason for you to come, right? Right. It's the hub of the brand. I think Walmart going to grocery may have been the smartest thing that they did. Target followed them very, very quickly afterwards, right? How do I give you a reason to come there on a consumable standpoint that you might stick around and buy something that is durable, right? Right. And I think that's the kind of model that works. I think specialty retail, right? When you're talking about giving me a reason, it's a brand that, like, I don't know, 90% of my product discovery on Instagram right now. Right.
Yeah.
But I'm terrified to buy it because I don't know what it's going to be, and I'm looking for return policy. But what if there was a store that I could go experience it at? Right.
Right.
And being in an urban setting, that there was one where startups and smart pop-ups could come in to be able to say periodically that they've got a product fair so you can start to understand it and experience it. I think
Yeah.
we're going to see that experiential component of that. I mean, Bass Pro Shop is probably a perfect example of,
Yeah.
if you love the outdoors, go to a Bass Pro
Yeah.
Shop. You can even, fish in the pond there if you want.
Right.
I think people have been trying to figure that out for a long time, but we started out overstored, and all we're doing is contracting to the right level.
Yeah.
And even my former employer, Macy's, is going to smaller format stores, right? Because they recognize being in a 30,000 square foot box, that the only thing that they could do is stuff it with stuff, because otherwise it would look empty. And you never
Right.
want a retailer to look empty, even though Apple does a fantastic job of making 4 products look incredible, right? So it's I think if you have great product, people will come find it. I truly believe that. And I think about my 78-year-old aunt who talks about, I don't have a place to go try it on. Maybe there's a different approach to that, right? Maybe it's I'll ship it to a location you can try it on before you buy it, type of thing, right? I think ingenuity will continue to come into this conversation, but I think just building a store and stocking it to the gills is a lost art, right?
Yeah. Just
Retail is theater. In terms of what that theater becomes, is still open ended.
yeah. Mike, I want to ask you, what is you think about we talked about this, just the sheer amount of orchestration and synchronization that takes place for what the Eighth Notch is doing. And again, at Optum, we're also under a lot of various constraints that, I often say to my fellow academic colleagues who happen to be my bosses in my last couple of roles. I mean, very smart, right? But there's this balance of the theoretically what's possible What is okay, great. In a perfect world, that's how it should look in a modeling scenario. But then we get into the feasibility of how do you operationalize that today, tomorrow, and years to come. What do you think are the biggest hurdles in making this come to scale sooner than later? What are the biggest constraints? What is it more of just there could be a lot of variables to consider here. But if Mike Robinson has that magic wand and says, here's a couple hurdles that if we can just overcome, and I make that sound simple, but what are those barriers that you feel like are the most prohibitive now to achieving this at a broader scale?
Yeah, and it's the hurdles that we're fighting every single day, right? Right. And you hit on it earlier. My internal measurement system says X, right? Right. And you're going to make it say X minus something, right? Right. So you've moved my cheese, right? Right. And when you move my cheese, to quote one of my favorite performance measurement books, you create problems for people. So how do you change that, right? How do you make this a win-win for people, right? And that's, I think that's why we settled on the financial benefit and the sustainability benefit associated with it, right? But I think anything in the logistics space, right? I mean, if people think that logistics is 100% synchronized and efficient, they're crazy, right? Because you have too many variables, right? Right, in order to be able to
Physical
look at it.
world stuff happens every day out there,
I
right?
mean, I mean, is there a world that this becomes even more AI driven, right? Right. In terms, I mean, if we want to give ourselves over to the machines, right, and not worry about the Skynet effect, right? Right. Which I think we all need to worry about to some level, but this is a perfect thing where computers are going to be faster than humans in terms of making a rational decision, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to be based on the logic, and it's going to be based on all the variables at play instead of logic sometimes, variable sometimes, and emotion other times. And I think that's where we can get wildly efficient, right? I mean, the very I mentioned to you this is probably the 20th or 21st podcast I've done. The first one I did was with the gentleman who lives off the coast of Spain, and he and I got into the conversation and saying, this is the beginning of smart cities. He said, if we really, really, really think about it, and we start thinking about
Big scale.
everything becomes scheduled, right? It becomes cars are off the road, trucks are off the road, things are scheduled. There are certain days that are delivery days and not delivery
Yeah.
days. There's certain days where you can move things and you can't move things. And he said, and it just got him thinking about it and saying,
Yeah.
so I said to him, I said, is that a Skynet moment for you? And he said, yeah, terrifying. It's both exciting and terrifying at the same time. Right, right, because we have to give over to the scheduling gods at that point, right?
Yeah.
Right, right. And that to me, I think is if we ever get to that point, then it becomes incredibly efficient, right? But in lieu of that, I think you got to take these moments of inefficiency, which is where we're at, and saying, how do we make this better? Which then, and I'll talk ad nauseum about us, but we're doing it at the destination. But then it becomes neighbor to my left, neighbor to my right, cul-de-sac, street, neighborhood, zip code, right? And you keep going out in terms of those nodes that you're willing to
Yes.
figure out efficiencies around. And if you're able to do that, even just in the urban setting, it may never work in the rural setting, but in the urban setting, it completely changes the game.
Right. Yeah, I was years ago. A little company called Microsoft had this. I saw a deck on this future's IoT sensor, this smart city notion, and it was again some generated images and graphics of like what this could be, and it was extremely exciting. But it goes back to my earlier point, like, okay, well, this is great in theory, but like, what is the timeline for us to achieve this with any level of stickiness? All things considered, and I think we left with more questions than answers when it came
Yeah.
down to some of those deeper
Well,
discussions.
well, in those really massive ideas, it's going to take a while, right? Right,
Oh, wait.
because you're dealing with people, right?
Right.
But I look at this and say, and I said it earlier, at least in the world that I'm living in, Amazon's doing the hardest job for me because they're already conditioning the consumer. And all I need is that the rest of the retailers look at that and say, I need to get there faster than I did the first two times.
That's right.
And because and every time I talk to them, I say, think about how you're being conditioned as a consumer. You're being pushed to think differently. And when you think differently, you choose differently. And when you choose differently, outcomes are different. And when outcomes are different, value is created.
Well said. Well said. Well, Mike, is there anything like we've talked quite a bit at length of this? I appreciate you kind of sharing your history and Again, we rarely have guests on, especially in the retail space that have your level of credentials. Now, when you think about kind of moving into next year, any predictions, any bold statements that you think? And I kind of leave this pretty open ended, but I get that question a lot. It's kind of like, oh, here we go, right on the spot. Anything that you see in terms of, again, going into a new calendar year next year, what are you most excited about? What scares you the most? Again, predictive wise, maybe some bold statements or anything along those lines that you want to kind of leave us with as we kind of wrap up today?
Yeah, and look, I mean, I challenge the audience to reach out to me and tell me I'm wrong next year when Nostradamus Mike was wildly ineffective.
Right.
I believe in conscious consumerism. I believe that we are going to think differently, right? And never thought I would be doing it. I'm in my late fifties, and I didn't think I'd be an eco warrior, but it just, when there's value created associated with it, I'd feel better about my choices, but I'm not changing my consumption patterns in terms of volume. I'm changing them in terms of type. I think that becomes part of it. And I think that conscious consumerism will move into the logistics space. I think we're going to see a move, maybe not as much next year as I would like, but I think in the near future towards this notion of mass customization, right? Right. That's something that feels very bespoke to you, but is, made at a mass level. And I think that AI is going to drive that a great deal, right? Right. In terms of being able to do that. I think the rise of generative AI will help people in their shopping journeys more than they know as they grow comfortable writing prompts, right, and being, I mean, I did that for, I've got I mentioned I'm a golfer, right? I said, I'm gonna go golf in Portugal at this time of the year. What should I think about from a weather and equipment standpoint? And it was
Right.
amazing what
Oh,
it came back with. In fact, it said you should go play these courses as well, right? I mean,
yeah.
it gave me more than I asked for. So
Incredible.
I think as we grow much more comfortable with those, chat assistants, right, in terms of that, and we use it at least as an advanced point of departure. I think that's going to be a place, and I want to believe that also the role of AI is human augmentation, not human replacement. It gives me an advanced point of departure in my personal life and my professional life, and that's what I want to believe that we're going to really, really, really drive towards as we think about using these great tools that some people want to scare us with and other people will want to make us dream with.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, as a fellow AI and technology, bullish around the space, just as you are, I'm always in this predicament of trying to explain that to. And again, I also factor in the generational gaps of
Totally.
the folks that are 50 plus. I think we fall in that category. Our view and vantage point versus the younger generations and the older ones too, right? We're still in this interesting space where there's so much unknown. There's a fear. There's an array of emotions come along with AI. I think you mentioned, I mean, as a fellow capitalist, like again, I talk to CEOs of publicly traded companies and their number one objective, to no surprise, appease the shareholders. And, we're in here to make a buck. And I think that's going to be the interesting thing for me is where does all this, again, all this has to come together with a human capital component, the bottom line, right, from the boardroom perspective. And again, I think I see you go into these fulfillment centers, right? Years ago, you had quite a few heads in there. And now with robotics and autonomous other solutions coming in there, you're starting to see that those kind of tasks just be turned over to robots. Again, even in my world, at the corporate world where they're planning and dispatching and routing and all that. And I think that we're still trying to figure out how do we make them feel a part of the conversation and not put that natural fear that they have of, am I working myself out of a job?
That's right.
And I don't think people are as transparent about that. Again, it's if I'm at the boardroom's going to answer differently than the operations folks on the floor, right? And I think that we're still in this interesting period of how we fuse that together. But I'm with you. I think I will serve a purpose. And I always say to people, technology in general has made us all redundant since the beginning of time, whether we know it or not, right? There's just things we don't do anymore. And I think that's the looming question is, well, if we're upskilling and reskilling the future workforce, what should they be working on? If software like what you and I are doing is no longer require a spreadsheet and a department of 40 people to try to piece all this together, right? And I think that's where the resistance comes in. So my biggest challenge is the change management, believe it or not. It's not that I don't believe in my technology. It's integrations are tough. Data is always a questionable. That's a component on just getting the pipes connected. But the overall, the biggest issue I see as a tech vendor is rightfully so, a human capital that's saying, if I embrace what you're saying, I know that I'm going to be made redundant. And I think that's something it's going to take a lot of folks and some bright minds to figure out how to piece that together and make it a win-win for everyone. And I don't know that we have that answer completely figured
Chris, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's those people that embrace that I'm going to be redundant and say, thank God,
out.
because now I have a chance to think about everything that falls between the lip and the cup. Because I believe the greatest opportunity will always be in those small areas that nobody is thinking about. I mean, the AI stuff is going to figure it out with the existing variables that we have.
That's right.
Right. I mean, I don't think we're going to make it smart and sentient enough to think about every single one of the inefficiencies. But the smart people will say, I'm no longer a scheduler, but I'm going to go find problems, right? I'm going to find
Bingo.
solutions to those problems. And if I can figure out how to grind out another 1%, another 2%, another 3% to throw into the AI to figure out how to continue to grind on that and find another 1% and a 2%. That's where I come back to human augmentation versus human replacement.
Yeah. And again, I think this is a debate. I'll have this conversation at least a dozen more times over this holiday with people having, whether it's having a beer or whatnot. And I don't always have the right answer because I think, again, there's a lot of unknowns still out there. And I look at it field like logistics, and I try to tell people it's a really complex puzzle that we're trying to solve. And I'm, in my lifetime, I don't know that we'll ever get to 100% automation. So to your point, Mike, I'm always trying to reiterate this. My message is to go, how do we balance the best of technology with the best of what humans have to offer, knowing the skill sets are very different. But I think we've gotten through generationally, especially in the last few decades, people have just gotten accustomed to data entry, spreadsheets. And I asked them, to your point, do you like doing that? Is that a good use of your time? Do you enjoy it? And it's usually, that's a paycheck. And I think that's when and then the question again, the looming question is, well, if I'm not doing this, what should I be doing? And I think that goes back to there are certain things that humans are innately very good at. These type of conversations, having the creative components and thinking of what's possible. AI, I don't know that it's there yet, and I speak specifically to the supply chain just because of the sheer amount of nuance and things that happen. Like I said, in the physical world, we cannot possibly try to predict. But yeah, the dumbest way I sell my product is I give you an advanced calculator effectively to do, and I always say it's not that you can't do long division, Mike, but why would you? Is that a good use of your time? And hopefully that resonates with them. And I think that's where tech companies are really struggling to get that, because there's a lot of great software that I always say becomes shelfware, not because the tech stack isn't slick and cool. It's because, again, the end user that ultimately has to adopt it is there's that fear and resistance to that change. And I feel like that's something that every tech vendor, yourself included, probably you'll go sell it to the executives that see, the CFO sees all the opportunity from a numerical standpoint, the metric improvement. Great, we're signing up with Mike in the eighth notch. Then you got to go deploy it, and you got to get down to that warehouse level or in the facility and tell a different skilled laborer that, hey, this is the new way. And that's kind of where things come to, like, is this going to happen? So I hope that you guys, again, I think a lot of tech companies don't do a good enough job in articulating, conveying the how we're doing this and why we're doing this and what are the implications and applications for you as an end user. And I can't tell you how many founders I talk, we were doing so well, and 6 months later we're seeing churn or we're not getting adoption. It's like, well, how much of an investment did you put into that change management piece? And they're like, ooh, good point. So I'm sure you struggle with the same,
Chris, I couldn't say it any better. And the fact that you said change management twice as maybe being the most important investment to make around a software investment is absolutely true. And it plays out every single time, right? I mean, I was implementing SAP in the 90s and it was a change management issue. I was implementing e-commerce in the 2000s and it was a change management issue. Now I'm looking at, fulfillment optimization, right? And I'm asking you to change a date on when you ship something. And
right.
It's a change management issue because you're asking humans to operate differently, right?
Yeah.
And in most cases, they're operating against their fears, right? And
That's right.
and if you can help them understand how not to fear the change, but embrace the change and understand where it takes them and what it allows them to do, then everything opens up.
Then
But you and I both know this is hard. This is hard.
Yeah. Well, Mike, that's change management again. It's another topic probably that we'll continue to discuss throughout all my podcast interviews. But Mike, I've taken well over an hour of your time off of a holiday, a weekend, no less. So appreciate you joining, man. I think it was very enlightening for me. I always try to think, there's things that I took away from just this one-on-one that I had no real privy into, namely around the apparel and the retail space. Love what the Eighth Notch is doing. And for those that might maybe want to reach out to you or learn more about you or the Eighth Notch initiative, how do they reach you? What's the best way?
Yeah, I would say contact me directly at mike.robinson@t8notch.com. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I'm the Mike Robinson in San Francisco. There are 1,000 Mike Robinsons out there, and it's kind of the hub of the brand, and you can follow what we're doing, or you can go to our website at t8notch.com as well.
Awesome. Well, folks, you heard it here. Mike, again, appreciate the time. I highly encourage everyone listening. This is the future. That's why we have guys like Mike on, because we see where it's going, and hopefully the audience does too. And as we've discussed today, this is an incremental approach to how we're trying to evolve these industries we play in. And I think we've touched on just about every facet of that conversation. So again, Mike, thanks for the time today, and appreciate everybody tuning in. And we'll be back in the near future with another episode of Semi-Related. So good luck, everybody. Have a great week. Try to stay awake coming off the food coma hangover for Thanksgiving. So we'll see you guys next time. Thank you.